Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to anyone that stuck with us the whole week and joined us for all the webinars, and a huge hello to everyone who's joining us today for the first time. My name's Emma and I'm the Events Officer at Hope for the Future, and it's my extreme pleasure to announce and host our final webinar in this series, Is the Media Failing Us on Climate Change? So we've been joined by some really brilliant speakers this week. On Monday, we heard from Candice Howarth and Alison Anderson, who talked to us about the challenges that communicators are facing when they're talking about climate change. On Tuesday, we heard from Emily Beeman and Awa Aburawa about their experiences of reporting on climate change and reflections on the role that the media should be playing in communicating climate change to the public. And then yesterday we heard from Leah Barassi, who gave us a really brilliant overview of why public opinion on climate change matters, and ways that we can more effectively be communicating climate change to the public. And all that's led really nicely to this final webinar, where we're going to be looking at how you can use the media to lobby your MP more effectively on climate change. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to give you a little bit of a background about Hope for the Future and a little bit more of a background about this webinar series, and then I'll just quickly run through some housekeeping. So Hope for the Future is a national climate communication charity, and we specialise in equipping communities, groups and individuals to have more effective conversations with their MPs about climate change. And just because of, the situation we're in at the moment, we really wanted to put on a webinar series that would kind of create a space where people could continue to have or start to have conversations about climate change at home. And in this series, we're exploring all of Hope for the Future's areas of outreach work. So we're starting with media this week, and then we move on to political leadership, MP engagement, families for the future, youth work, and then finally our faith work. This particular webinar is part of Hope for the Future's Press Here for Change project, which is funded by Gower Street and aims to connect local politicians with local media outlets so that we can get more news articles in the local press about climate change that are written by MPs and for MPs and bring them closer with their constituents. We'd also really like to say a huge thank you to the European Climate Foundation for funding our events project, and that's allowed us to bring you this whole series of events, so we're very grateful. So before we get started, I just need to go over some housekeeping. So firstly, we are recording this webinar and it will be available on demand for you to watch again and also to share with other people. We'll be sending all of our attendees a follow-up email which will direct you to more about Hope for the Future, our latest resources, more information about webinars in this series, and also some information about potential next steps that you could take after watching this. So we plan to be wrapped up by 3 o'clock, and we've got around 30 to 35 minutes for our speakers today. I'll then be putting some questions to them for about 15-20 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Georgina, who's going to give us a very brief wrap up of what we've done this week. So how can you get involved at home? You can pop your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and you also have the power there to upvote questions by giving those questions that people have already put in there a little thumbs up, and doing that will just prioritise it and send it right to the top of our list so we've got more chance of seeing it. You can also get involved on social media by hashtagging HFTF webinar or hashtagging Common Home, and also on your dashboard you'll be able to see a chat box. You can use this as a space to introduce yourself to other people on the webinar, have a chat with webinar attendees while the speakers are presenting, and my colleague Georgia is also on this call, is going to be monitoring that chat if you have any questions that aren't related to what the speakers are talking about. She'll be on hand to help you with any queries. And finally, at the end of the webinar, we'll also have a feedback form that's popping up If you could take a few minutes to fill that out, we'd be hugely grateful. And all the feedback you give us helps us to, make these events better for you. And we've got quite a few more coming up soon, so any feedback would be really appreciated. So without any further ado, I'm really delighted to welcome our speakers today. I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Karina Mundell-Garrett and Georgina Collins. Karina is the Regional Coordinator at Hope for the Future and heads up our the work we deliver in London and across the south of England. Georgina is our Media Outreach Officer, and she leads on the Press Here for Change project, as well as our internal and external media work. So we'll first be hearing from Karina, who's going to take us through a very whistle-stop version of Hope for the Future's training on how to have more effective conversations with your MP. And then we'll hear from Georgina, who's going to take us through how we can put these principles into practice and think about how to use the media as a tool to lobby our MPs on climate change. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and hand over to you, Karina, and hopefully this will be seamless.
Thanks, Emma. I'll just get the slides up. So hi everyone, thanks again for joining. And as Emma said, I'm Karina and I manage the work of Hope for the Future in London. So today I'm just going to give a really short introduction to the work that Hope for the Future does, and I'll let Georgina tell you more about how we can actually use the media to lobby the MPs as well. And if you're interested in learning more about our work, Sarah Robinson, our Deputy Director, will be joining us on a webinar in a couple of weeks, and we'll be discussing it more then. And you're also very welcome to get in touch with us, and we'd be really happy to work with you. So yeah, basically, let me just change the slide. So basically the whole Hope for the Future approach is based on research that we've done, which shows that the most effective way to lobby your MP is to build a relationship with them. And I'm sure we've all seen the way in which politics is generally portrayed, in the way that it's reported at PMQs and in interviews. It always seems to be about catching politicians out, and it always seems to be about refusing to give concrete answers. And that's really, really ineffective, and it doesn't really get us anywhere. And it's really understandable, of course, then, for lobbyists and campaigners and constituents, if that's the only representation that we see in the media of politics, if that's how we think politics should be done, it's really understandable that we model our behaviour on that, and that we repeat those patterns when we're trying to lobby MPs. But we've found in the past that that's really, really ineffective. And so what we really want to be doing is to encourage people to try our relationship-based approach. And building that relationship begins with empathy, and it begins with understanding what it's like to be an MP. So here are some of the things you might want to be considering when you look at what it means to be an MP and how that might impact on an MP's behaviour or their willingness to engage with you as a campaigner. For example, you have MPs with huge, huge time constraints on their hands. They'll be in Parliament Monday to Thursday generally, that's when the business is, and business can go on really late into the night. It's exhausting, or at least it can be. And then Fridays and Saturdays, they'll be working in the constituencies. They might have Sunday with their families. They've got a huge amount of travelling, and it's just a lot of pressure on them to be an MP with those time constraints. And then, for example, on the issues like climate change, they might be feeling really disempowered. They're working at a local level, and it's a global problem. So that's something that we will be exploring further in the next webinar series. But there's definitely could be a feeling that they don't really have the power to take action. And another example would be that campaigners do tend to have quite a negative perception with MPs if you have been modelling your behaviour in the past on that really adversarial, confrontational style that is really typical in politics these days. They might be really wary of working with you in the future because that's what they might be expecting from you as well. So these are all things that we really need to be taking into account when we're thinking about how we work with our MP. And here you can see some examples of MPs talking in the media about what it's like to be an MP. So for example, we have Rob who's talking about how busy he is and how he's receiving hundreds and hundreds of emails that aren't necessarily personal or local or relevant, and that might be really difficult for him. And we've also got here Ellie Cooper, who's a vet keeper's daughter, talking about how scary it can be to be an MP these days, or to have an MP in your family, when there's so much polarisation and even a rising threat of violence in politics in the UK these days. So leading on from that, we can start thinking about what it actually means to be a good influencer. And we've found, and I think many others have found, that generating feelings of safety, well-being and trust is what's really important if you want to build a collaborative relationship. And that actually, if you build on fear, and if you engender feelings of stress in people, but they actually can't see someone else's perspective, you actually get locked into a stress, flight or fight response. And triggering those survival instincts means that you can't come up with collaborative solutions. So, in spite of all that, that sounds really heavy and complicated, but actually it can be really simple to make something personal. It can be really simple to make something resonate with an MP. And this is an example that we really like. This is a tweet from Louise Haigh, who's an MP in Sheffield. And she says that she'd strongly recommend hair compliments as a lobbying tactic. Because this email she received was signed off, "Best wishes, love your hair, Helen." And we think that's just a really great example of taking something that's really short and sweet, but making it personal, and remembering that just like everyone else, an MP loves a compliment. And then, in order to build a relationship effectively, we believe that you do really need to know a bit about your MP. And it's quite a lot like this quote that we use from Ken Hamer, which says that designing a presentation without your audience in mind is like writing a love letter and addressing it to whom it may concern, which is clearly not the best way to go about that. But also it's really appropriate because we've spoken to so many MPs in the past who regularly receive campaign emails where the sender hasn't even bothered to learn their name and has just left it with "Dear insert name of the MP here." And I don't think that that would be a surprise to anyone to learn that that is really off-putting if that's the kind of emails you're receiving day in, day out. So rather than trying to engage with an MP without even learning their name, we think that when preparing to engage with an MP, it's important to learn as much about them as you can. And so here are some really great resources for doing that. They Work For You there's an example on the slide here. That one's Marcia de Cordova, and it's a really great resource for voting records in Parliament. You can search by theme, you can find out what your MP's record is, but potentially on housing, but also the environment, which is quite relevant to us as people who are really interested in climate change. We've got Hansard, which is a record of everything that has been said or submitted in writing in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. So that's a really, really extensive resource. Their social media is really great because that's a really personal one. I worked for an MP in the Houses of Parliament, and although you would have his staff generally replying to his emails, he had full control over all of his social media, and he was really interacting with his constituents directly and really responding to issues as they arose in real time, in his own words. So that's a really great place to get in touch with your MP and really see what their response is to issues as they're happening. Their websites can be fantastic for finding out what they campaigned on in elections. That's really where you find what their local election campaign was based on. That will be all on that website. And in terms of what they've then been doing locally since their election, you can look to the local news, because that's where you'll find what they've been getting involved in since then. And word of mouth, you might not think of that one, but it's a really useful one as well. You could talk to someone who knows your MP, and you might not know that people know your MP. For example, I was speaking to someone recently about my MP. I had no idea that they had any connection to them at all. but they just turned around to me and was like, oh yeah, I teach his son guitar. And that's just something else that you then learn about your MP and their family and like what makes them tick. That can be really useful to just like see that MP as a human, which is really helpful. And finally, YouTube. You could very much go down a YouTube rabbit hole and find every interview that your MP has ever done, which may or may not be a good use of your time in lockdown, but that's for you to decide. But it's a really great place to see how your MP speaks, what are the issues that they get asked to speak on, what are the key words that really light them up, what are the things that they really don't want to talk about, what kind of interaction makes them engage with you really well, and what kind of things make them really shut down. So yeah, these are all really great resources all together. And once you've done your research, you should be able to build a really good picture and a really clear picture of what your MP's agenda is, especially locally. And if you have a really clear idea of what your agenda is as well, you will be able then to put those two things side by side and start to think about what are the issues on which you have common ground and what are the issues on which you can ask them to take action because you both have a shared vision and a shared goal in that area. So here's an example of how that could work. You might be in a constituency where there are really high local levels of air pollution and fuel poverty. And obviously we're climate campaigners. That's something that we really believe in. Taking action on climate change is what we want to see. Your MP might be really against that. They might really want to avoid talking about it or being seen to talk about climate change. It might seem really controversial to them. But they might be really keen to be acting on local issues, and they might be really keen to be seen to be championing their constituents. And that might seem like we have absolutely no way to start working with that MP. But in fact, we can make climate issues local issues. And one way that we could do that in this constituency example would be asking our MP to support government plans for clean air zones, or support tax relief for community energy projects, which could address those issues of air pollution and fuel poverty. And finally, I think it's really important to remember that like any relationship, a relationship with your MP is a two-way street, and it's not just about asking for what we want, it's about what we can offer them in return as well. And then, so these are examples of things that we could potentially offer to our MPs. Especially for new MPs, that might be stronger links with the community if they don't feel particularly established yet and they're really struggling to reach out to their constituents. It might be that this is an issue that they really care about already, but no one's been speaking to them about it before. And so if you do go to the MP with that issue, they'll have a constituency mandate to go and raise that in the House of Commons. And that might be something that they're really keen to do. I think Georgina will be talking more about the publicity in the local media in a minute for you, but I think we are all quite clear that any MP loves a good photo opportunity, so good publicity will always be a winner. And finally, it might be as simple as just appealing to the moral code and their values, and it might be as simple as something that they really want to feel like they've contributed to the lives of their constituents. And if you can prove that what you're doing is going to be impacting people in a really positive way, that might be enough of a reward for that MP. So that's our training in about 10 minutes, which is a lot shorter than it usually is. But the key things that you should probably take away from that are that if you're preparing to engage with your MP, you want to be making sure you do your research and you know a lot about them. You want to be looking for the areas on which you can have common ground and where you can have like a shared goal and a shared vision. And you want to remember that it's a two-way relationship. And when you're doing all of that, you want to be making sure that empathy is absolutely at the heart of what you're doing and you're approaching your MP as a fellow human. So yeah, if you'd like to hear any more about that, please stay tuned for our next webinar series, and also definitely get in touch with us and would be really happy to work with you on that in the future. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Georgina and she's going to tell you more about the media.
Thank you, Karina. I'm just going to share my screen. Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Karina. That was really brilliant, and yeah, much shorter than it normally is. So please do get in touch with us if you would like any more support. As some of you already know, I'm Georgina, the Media Outreach Officer here at Hope for the Future. And I work on a project which connects MPs with local and regional media to discuss climate change. And I'm just going to talk you through a bit about why this is an important and effective way of lobbying. It can be a great tool to demonstrate to MPs why climate change is relevant to their own constituency, which isn't always something that they know. And it can be done in lots of different ways. It can allow you to be quite creative. It can be that you write a piece, the MP can write a piece. It can be about coverage of a local event. It can just be writing a letter to your newspaper. So there's all sorts of things we can do with it. Cool. So I'm just going to begin by exploring the relationship between media and climate change a bit, which is kind of touching on a few issues that we've discussed this week already. I think this quote is an interesting place to start. As communications researchers, we want to know why, if climate change entered public discussion more than 30 years ago, and we've been covering it as a global problem since, we can't slow warming of the climate down. So it kind of sums up why it's important to delve a little bit deeper when we're thinking about the relationship between the media and the climate crisis. So why has the way media has reported on climate change not necessarily led to public action? So one thing to think about is journalistic norms and values, for instance, objectivity. One of the challenges of journalistic objectivity, which I think everyone knows by and large is a good thing, is that to avoid allegations of bias, journalists can sometimes present conflicting range of possibilities. And in the case of climate change, that's kind of led to a situation where historically climate change has been reported in a way that leaves room for doubt. This is less common in recent years as climate change has become more prominent in the public discourse and something that's more widely accepted. But it's still something to consider. And kind of in today's world, something similar is that it can be difficult for journalists to make a link between extreme weather events and climate change if there isn't data that they see as rigorous enough to connect those two things. So I'm kind of talking about local media and local weather events. It's difficult for them to feel like they can connect it rigorously. And so when we think about the images and reporting we see in the media on climate change, it generally doesn't connect to the average person's life. In the UK is something else to think about. It doesn't emphasize the fundamental truth that climate policy affects all the choices that people are making on a daily basis. It affects, how you get to work, what you pay for fuel bills, and your life expectancy ultimately. Instead, you kind of get this disaster movie type narratives playing out, often seen in very far-flung countries. This was touched on by our speakers, Alison and Candice, and they described climate change often being seen as a distant and abstract threat and visualization. So when you think about how climate change is reported, you also have to think about what journalists consider news. Environmental news tends to be low down media agendas competing with, crime, terrorism, at the moment, coronavirus, news stories with strong human interest angles that are focused on climate change will propel it into the headlines, but the sort of slow moving science won't necessarily be seen as valuable to report from the journalists I've had conversations with. So Arwa in our second session touched on this when she talks about how the media struggles to report on structural and slow moving issues. And journalists I've spoken to have said that they've talked to their editors about wanting to cover a climate change story, and they'll get the response of we've done that already, like we've covered it, there's nothing left to say, which obviously for people within the climate movement is bizarre. So just moving on, so it's important that we consider the type of imagery that we see in the media representing climate change and why it can be a barrier to action. So I've laid out a few examples of this. For those who were at the talk yesterday, Leo talked about the sort of phenomenon of sad polar bears that you see often related to climate change. Images that things happening to other people or that are extreme or anti the status quo is quite often the visuals that you see. But the images I put on the left, I'm hoping will demonstrate how we communicate the positive co-benefits of climate change. So in a way that relates to people's lives, you know, public transport, housing, green spaces. So it's worth thinking about the stories and narratives that we present when we're talking about climate change in the media. Are they likely to encourage people to take action, or are they presenting an extreme or overwhelming reality? A great organisation, Climate Visuals, works on this. They're trying to change the type of imagery that we see in the media in relation to climate change. So now I'm going to talk about the relationship between MPs and the media. So also very complex and fraught. Former press officer Nicole Valentuzzi describes how the media can play a real key role in agenda setting within Parliament. So ministers will see it as a really valuable tool for not only communicating their policies to the public, but also within Parliament, because it increases the cost to other MPs for opposing their policy if it has had positive press. So Jo Swinson talked about this, that positive press coverage of a shared parental leave policy made it more difficult for MPs within Parliament to be seen opposing it. So as well as this positive symbiotic relationship, MPs are also worried by negative media coverage, something that I'll go into more detail later, and particularly from their local press outlets, because they really want to keep them on side. Yeah, so when we're thinking about MPs' relationship to the media, we also need to think about their relationship with their constituents. Michael Sayward wrote a book called The Representative Claim. A very brief, simplified version of this is that MPs don't just win an election and get to do what they want. They continue to be sort of held accountable, we hope anyway, to their constituents as they're dependent on them for support. So representation is an ongoing process. So politicians will make and modify their claims in sort of an ongoing dialogue with their constituents and with those they seek to represent, to demonstrate to them that they're carrying out their role appropriately. So I'm not going to go into an enormous amount of detail on this, but essentially by putting themselves out there in the media, particularly on an issue like climate change, which for many MPs up until recently was seen as quite controversial, they're making a statement to their constituents who may choose to reject it, making themselves vulnerable. And this can particularly be the case with an issue that might have national salience, but not local salience. So they might think that their constituents aren't interested in the issue. So I think it kind of demonstrates how media can be a double-edged sword for MPs, but it can also be a really powerful tool. And I think the use of it as a tool is pretty well demonstrated by this slightly tongue-in-cheek quote that I'm hoping you'll take with a pinch of salt, that MPs love local media as much as their own children, which I heard from the ex-press officer of an MP. So local media is a really important way that they can get their message to their constituents, basically, and consequently, they care a lot about it. So now I'm going to discuss just why local media is so valuable to British society. I think this quote from Mark Thompson, who's the CEO of the New York Times Company and ex-Director General of the BBC, really highlights why these outlets are important and why it's important they're engaging on an issue like climate change. He says, a society which fails to provide its different communities and groups with the means to listen and come to understand each other's past and presents shouldn't be surprised if mutual incomprehension and division are the consequence. So it's just something worth thinking about. Yeah, and sort of going on from there, a 2016 study by King's College London found that towns in the UK that had suffered local newspaper closures had a democracy deficit. So they had measurably reduced community engagement and a heightened distrust of public institution. And there's been other studies, both in the UK and the US, that have brought concerns about lack of local news, meaning lack of scrutiny for local decision making, which that's kind of like the bread and butter of getting a green economy in place. Is a lot of it, the decision making is happening locally. So as highlighted with one study by Candice and Alison, who were here with us on Monday, visualization, frames and narratives that individuals can connect with at a local level can increase the salience of the issue and have powerful resonance and create a common base for learning and dialogue. So just why it's important for an issue like climate change to be included in local press. Local media was also very widely read and very widely trusted. A 2018 YouGov poll in the UK found that 3 times as many people claimed they trusted local newspapers over social media. And so I think lots of people don't really necessarily see the relevance of local media, but studies have shown it's very important. And I think local news has a power to engage people who are outside of the sort of climate movement echo chamber that we can find ourselves in, and communicate to people why green issues are applicable to their lives and how they can make their lives better, which isn't necessarily something that we're hearing enough of at the moment. So I just wanted to run through some barriers to action and sort of how we can overcome them. So for the media, barriers to action for engaging with the issue of climate change, that is. So the media has at times struggled to articulate climate science really effectively, particularly attribution and probabilities of risk, which is what I touched on earlier. And this can be particularly challenging at a local level when you commonly hear, but you know, there was bad weather when I was a kid, and things like that is quite often the response when you're connecting the extreme weather events to climate change. So decisions on climate change tend to take place at the local level, but the science and evidence aren't framed locally, they're framed internationally or nationally. So mainstream media outlets are quick to report on extreme weather events, but up until recently they have been quite slow at making that link to climate change. This relates to the visuals we see as well. So Emma touched on this yesterday. When there's a heat wave in the UK, that is scientifically related to climate change, the only visuals we normally see are people out enjoying sunshine in the park. So there's a bit of a disconnect there. And commercial links and underfunding, more than 80% of UK local newspapers by circulation are owned by just 6 companies. And the last decade has been terrible for funding for the local news. Staff have been laid off, physical offices are shut down, often different local newspapers all share one office. And there's huge understaffing, so they end up being over-reliant on press releases and material provided by the authorities, which can give undue prominence to parties with vested interest. And as mentioned previously, climate change can be pushed down the agenda. I mean, the coronavirus outbreak is a brilliant example of this, but also, you know, anything, celebrity, terrorism, things like that, it gets moved down. And then just on to MPs. Many of the MPs' barriers to action, Karina touched on already. MPs are extremely busy and generalists who often lack the confidence or knowledge to speak with authority, particularly appearing in the media, talking about an issue like climate change. Many fear bad press for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. MPs I've been working with recently didn't want to publish articles we had drafted about green issues during the coronavirus pandemic because they didn't want to be seen as being insensitive, even though, you know, these issues aren't going away. They're often juggling pressure from multiple sources, and something on the national agenda might contradict the local agenda and vice versa. And this is particularly a challenge with MPs wanting to appear in local media about talking about something like climate change. Is they maybe talk about it nationally, but perhaps don't think it appeals to their constituents on a local level. So as we touched on previously, with representation being ongoing, MPs are trying to prove their worth to constituents all the time and don't want to contradict that. So sometimes an MP who is passionate about tackling climate change on a national platform doesn't seem to focus on that platform locally. This is particularly the case when there are local issues that conflict with green policies. So Rebecca Willis wrote an article in The Guardian, which came out today, which kind of brilliantly frames this issue, because she did anonymous surveys of MPs. And many felt very conflicted and pressured because they spoke about climate change and really wanted green issues to be tackled nationally, but they had polluting industries as big sources of employment in their local constituencies. And, you know, there's no simple solution to this. MPs aren't all powerful. And I think everyone knows how important it is that we transition equitably to a greener economy. But I think what it does do is highlight the importance of having these conversations, which local media can facilitate. So the UN body, the ILC, lists social dialogue as one of the 4 key ways we can transition fairly to an environmental, sustainable economy and society. And I think media, particularly local media, is a really brilliant way we can have an inclusive dialogue. So just on to some practical advice on how we can use the media as a lobbying tool to work with your local representative on climate change. So firstly, think about the stories and images that we talked about previously. You know, your local paper, your MP, the people in your local community are unlikely to see why a polar bear is relevant. It's probably just going to depress them. But instead, think about the co-benefits of climate change, you know, reduced healthcare costs, support for local economies, physical and mental health, and many more things. So if we can effectively communicate these co-benefits and why climate change policy is positive for everyone, it's more likely that action will be taken. Furthermore, remember to just be empathic, as Karina explained, when you're dealing with an MP, that they're a human being. You're not going to get them to help you, you're not going to get them to appear in the media talking about an issue like this if you are aggressive or don't understand their perspective from where they're coming from. So just onto some more kind of general tips. Understand what makes a good story and framing. So think about shareability. Nowadays, a big part of news is whether it's going to be applicable on social media. With shareability, you often hear kind of, does it make you laugh? Does it make you cry? Does it make you angry? You've got to think about the message that you're sending. It sounds obvious, but it has to be local if you're wanting it to be published in local media. It can't be about climate change globally. And again, this is the challenge I think that we face, that there often isn't data that is as local as we need it to be. And it has to be news or an update on an ongoing story. I talked to a lot of journalists who got very frustrated about people approaching them with articles that weren't new. It's called a news hook. So it's got to be something that's relevant to today, basically. And journalists told me it's ideally about people, how people are affected by something, what people are saying or doing. So we've got to move away from the climate change messaging that has historically led to a lack of action, I think, which is focusing on fear instead of how green policies can actually improve people's lives and why it is applicable to their lives. So know how news organisations work. So anyone can pitch an article to a local news organisation. There'll be a general telephone number and email address, which will be available on their website. But it's a good idea to connect with a friendly journalist who can kind of take your story forward. It saves getting lost in the news desk, and from the journalists I talked to, the news desk normally got 1,000 or more emails a day in addition to the emails that individual reporters were getting. So, you know, try and take that hope for the future approach and build a relationship with a journalist. And yeah, keep in mind that news outlets are underfunded and understaffed. So again, that hope for the future approach, but also that hope for the future can support you on this. And I'll come to that in a minute, but we're not expecting you to do all of this yourself. That's my job. And don't be afraid of the phone. Both MPs, offices and news organisation, it can be a great way to get in touch. I think people nowadays love emailing, and phoning can feel quite awkward. But it can be a great way, if you're not getting replies on email, to just establish that initial relationship. You can get the person's name who you're dealing with and take it forward from there. But do be wary that both MPs and media outlets are overworked and lack time capital. So don't phone up for a nice chat. But if you're prepared and you're clear and concise about why you're phoning, it can be a great way to get the ball rolling. And know how MPs' offices work. So try and connect with a caseworker or a press officer within the MP's office who are likely to reply to your initial email anyway. If you have a phone call, ask the name of the person you're dealing with, a bit like with a journalist, so you can take it forward with them. And it's generally easier to get organised when dealing with a caseworker who can build a relationship, just because the MP is likely to have many time commitments and they can organise your meeting with the MP for you. And know who your audience is. So think about who you're trying to convince. Is it members of the public? Are you trying to advertise an event that you're running? Are you trying to convince Parliament about a piece of legislation? Lobbying your MP using local media can include any of these. So think about these different audiences and try to be as inclusive as possible. One moment. Yeah, so I thought I'd touch on the different ways that you can actually be involved in local media. So you can organise a local event and invite the local press, and you can send a letter to the local paper, which is kind of, that might be a good initial introduction to this kind of thing. You know, I think it's really important to emphasise to engage with the news. Arwa and Emily, who are the journalists who joined us on earlier in the week on Tuesday, mentioned that if you want to see more coverage of climate change or issues that matter to you in your local community, just engage with the media, give them the feedback on this kind of content that you're seeing, because it will give them a mandate to publish the things you want to see. Another option is to suggest that an MP writes an opinion piece about a local issue, you know, maybe public transport, maybe a community garden, local weather events such as flooding. You can make climate change relevant to that constituency, because it is. And yeah, please do get in touch with Hope for the Future about this, because we can support you every step of the way and work out a way that will work for your MP or your campaign or the event you're running, because it's going to be different for everybody. Yeah, please do get in touch with us, basically, is the takeaway message. Karina, if you would like to work with your MP, and me if you would like any support with media work. I'll hand back over to Emma now.
Thanks, George, and thanks, Karina. They were brilliant presentations. I have seen, obviously, bits and pieces before, but it's always great to see it in action. I just wanted to start, before we got to the questions, I wondered, George, if you could tell us a little bit more about a time that you've used the media to effectively lobby an MP and support a constituency in that process.
Yeah, so we've worked with a few MPs now on the project. Alexander Stafford, who is an MP in, I actually forget his constituency now because there's too many.
Rother Valley.
Rother Valley, wrote a brilliant piece for the Yorkshire Post about flooding in the local constituency, because obviously that's a really big issue in Yorkshire. And what was brilliant is it's kind of, you can see how long-term engagement with an MP works, and how media can play a really key role in that, because he first came to one of our schools workshops and he's a new MP as of 2019. He came to a schools workshop where he talked to lots of pupils about the issue of flooding, many of whom had been affected themselves. And that came off the back of an MP meeting with a constituent. And then we went on to support him in writing an article for the Yorkshire Post, which got some brilliant responses, where he was making those connections between the local weather events that you're seeing and the need to tackle climate change on a national scale. Yeah, so we've had brilliant responses to it.
That's great, and it's just really interesting to hear what the project looks like in action and the kind of impact that it can have. So I'm going to take the top question in our Q&A box, which comes from Mark, and it's: non-reporting on slow-moving issues can lead to flimsy news, so not news that's not sufficiently in enough depth. Do you think that things like the Climate Assembly in the UK will help to shake this up a bit?
I think definitely. I think in my experience and from a lot of the conversations I've been having with kind of journalists and MPs alike, it's kind of changing the narrative around climate change, because I agree that we've got to have reporting on the kind of the nitty-gritty and the science, and we don't want to just end up having flimsy reporting. And I think a really great way to do that is that sort of engagement with the climate assemblies, with local community events that we're seeing. Things like that, I think, can really ground the issue in people's lives and is a positive take, but isn't flimsy, isn't silly, is actually still people making really important progress towards a kind of greener UK. You know, community energy projects would be another example.
Thank you. So I'm going to take another question from a little further down. I think it overlaps quite nicely with the stuff that Candice and Alison were talking about on Monday, with challenges of communicating climate change in the media, and maybe some of the issues that academics have when it comes to doing that. And Charlotte's asked, is there a lack of local science to help journalists link local issues to climate change? And do you think that there could be some schemes put in place that help train journalists to find and or use scientific research papers to help them back up their claims?
Yeah, so there is a lack of science on the very, very local level. It's difficult because I think it plays into the issue of kind of science literacy that we've touched on a lot this week. I come from a humanities background and I sometimes struggle to understand the climate science that's going on. But there are schemes in place that are actually helping to train scientists and journalists on this issue, I think, to work together. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but we can send it in the follow-up email. But yeah, I think it is a really important issue to overcome, and I think we're getting better at it. And I think as people are understanding the issue of climate change more in the last few years, as it has entered the public discourse more, you're seeing less of the responses of, you know, the classic thing is when you're relating a local flooding event to climate change, you'll hear, but it flooded in 1973, you know, why is that any different? You know, every often we have rain, you know, that doesn't make a difference. But I think you're seeing less of that, and I think the media are getting better at explaining why these things are connected. And I also think it's just highlights the importance of not getting stuck in an echo chamber, that actually not everyone understands climate science. Not everybody will, you know, read an article about flooding and connect that to climate change, even if they kind of relate it to in the article, if they've just got a quote from a single climate scientist, which is quite jargon heavy, which is something else we've touched on this week. It's not necessarily easy for people to understand, myself included. And I think having these kind of more inclusive conversations in different media outlets that aren't just kind of, you know, Green Alliance blogs or The Guardian, but actually that a lot of people across the UK are reading, can really help.
So we need more local science and we need it to be more accessible. Great. And we have a question from Rory who says, this is probably one that you could come in on as well, Karina. I found this week's sessions really inspiring, thank you, and have encouraged me to write to my MSP and MP to ask them to support a green recovery post-COVID. As has been discussed in some of the areas of media, given the topic of the next series of webinars, would it be worth waiting until after this time to write to my MP and MSP?
I'm going to hand that to Karina, I think.
Thanks, Rory. That's a really good question. I think my answer depends very much on whether you mean, do we wait until after the next series of webinars, or do we wait until COVID is no longer a problem? Because if we wait until COVID is no longer a problem, we've missed our opportunity. And I wouldn't necessarily, well, or maybe opportunity is not the right word, but there's definitely a window in which we need to be having these conversations, and it's before they become an issue in Parliament. And the way that we recover from COVID is going to be going through Parliament. It's going to be on politicians' minds long before COVID disappears from our landscape and long before it disappears from our lives. And in actual fact, a lot of those discussions are probably starting to happen now. So yeah, I think definitely, as long as the way that you frame that is really empathetic and really sensitive, now is 100% the time to be writing those letters and having those meetings and having those discussions. Yeah, because it's not something that we want to feel like we've missed the boat on, and those decisions will have been made, quite a lot sooner than we think they will have been by the time that we're all ready to have conversations that aren't about COVID again.
I'll just add to that as well that Hope for the Future is actually in the process of putting together a virtual lobbying guide for kind of this stage where we're needing to move towards talking about green recovery and engaging with your MP again, which we kind of pressed pause on just because of the stresses that MPs were under. And that should be coming out in the next few weeks. So keep an eye out for that, because it will have a lot of stuff about kind of how to tactfully make that transition now into focusing on what the recovery is going to be and making sure it's built on those green principles.
Yeah, and there'll be more about the virtual lobbying guide in the follow-up email from this webinar series, and also a little bit of a tease, I suppose, about our MP availability project that we've been doing, running recently, which has been looking at how MPs have been coping with their workload during coronavirus, and to what extent they're kind of back to work and we can support constituents to meet with them about climate change. So do look out for both those things. I think we've got time for a couple more. So I'm going to give you, Kit has brought us a problem that I wonder if you can help him with, George. My MP has a Twitter account which he doesn't use very often, mainly to say that he's been at an event, but he never replies to Twitter queries or citations, even though they are polite. Any advice on whether and how to use this form of engagement?
Yeah, it's difficult because I think it depends on the MP, because you get some MPs who are very social media savvy. We saw Louise Hay earlier, and who love being in the Twitter sphere, but then you get other MPs who really aren't interested. So I would say maybe don't keep trying if it's not working, because that can alienate an MP as well if it ends up sort of being spam. But maybe talk to the office directly, ask them about whether they're prepared to engage more on social media. That might be a better way to do it. There might be a friendly staff member within the office who's trying to encourage the MP to use social media more. You never know. But yeah, I would say don't keep trying if you're not getting responses. Maybe change your approach and see how that goes. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that was great. And then I'll just take one last one from Sarah that says, a lot of the messages from this week have been around the importance of local media and local action. Do you think that generating enough local activity on climate change can translate into the global action that we need to tackle the issue?
I mean, I definitely think it's part of it. I'm not going to say it's the magical solution that can get us where we need to go, but I also think it's something really important that isn't necessarily being included in kind of the narrative of how we get there. You see a lot of stuff about international climate conferences and everything, but actually local grassroots activism is really important. I always remember something that Dustin Benton, who I think was the head of policy at Green Alliance, talked to me about, which was that you know, the changes that are going to have to be made in order for us to transition are fundamentally about infrastructure, and, you know, changing the light bulbs we have, changing the energy sources we have, you know, changing the public transport we have, and most of those decisions are made at a local level. So you can't underestimate the importance of that kind of local activism. And including people in the conversation about what the future is going to look like, because I mean, it's going to have to happen. And yeah, that we've never kind of had a social movement or a huge change before as a society that is so much focused on changing infrastructure. So that we've got to concentrate on that local activism, is what I'd say, and local engagement is really, really important.
That's great, thank you, George. And I think that's a really good place to leave, not just the end of this webinar, but the end of the series. I'm going to pass back to you just for a minute to round up this week and yeah, point people in the direction of what's coming next.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, thank you everyone who has joined us, you know, either all this week or for just one or two of the webinars, or one. All I'd say is please do get in touch with us. Hope for the Future's whole approach is based on that we can offer tailored one-on-one support. We can engage with you over, you know, a long period of time to help you work through your relationship with your MP. We can help you run events. Emma is the brilliant events officer. She works with constituents to put local events on. You know, we can do schools workshops. We've got a brilliant youth outreach officer who puts workshops on in schools, and he's been doing virtual workshops while schools have been closed. I can help you with local media. We kind of all work together to make some really brilliant local activism happen. So I would say, if you're feeling inspired, please do get in touch with us, and we can action kind of lots of the points we've talked about this week, because I can imagine it has been quite overwhelming of a whistle-stop tour. And yeah, please do sign up for some of our other webinars that we have coming, because we've got some brilliant speakers that are going to be announced. Starting early next week, we'll have some more speaker announcements for the next webinar, which starts in 2 weeks' time. Am I right? On Monday,
A week on Monday.
A week on Monday, there you go. And yeah, please do sign up, have a look through the Eventbrite. We'll send any relevant resources in the follow-up email. And just thank you all for taking the time to engage on these issues. I think it's really great to be having these conversations. I'll just pass.